I pulled into the Outer Banks Marina parking lot at 4:30 in the morning, already questioning every decision that led me to this moment. The asphalt felt cold under my feet as I stepped out of my car, and I could smell the salt air mixed with diesel fuel from the fishing boats. My stomach had been doing somersaults since I woke up, though I couldn't tell if it was from nerves or the thought of spending the next 12 hours on a boat with Marcus. The marina stretched out before me in the pre-dawn darkness, a maze of wooden docks lined with vessels of every size. Most of the slips held smaller boats, weekend warrior types with names like Real Deal and Hook, Line, and Sinker painted across their sterns. But scattered among them were the serious fishing boats, the ones that looked like they meant business. I checked my phone for the third time, confirming I was at the right place. Slip 27. The Orca 3. The sound of a diesel engine roaring into the parking lot made me turn around. Marcus's brand new pickup truck swung into the space next to mine, its headlights sweeping across the dock. The truck was one of those massive things, probably cost more than most people made in a year. He'd been going on about it for weeks, like owning an expensive truck somehow made him more qualified for deep-sea fishing. Marcus jumped out of the driver's seat, already talking before his feet hit the ground. "Ben, you ready to catch the big one today?" I walked over to where he was already unloading gear from the truck bed. The amount of equipment he'd brought was ridiculous. 3 different rod cases, 2 tackle boxes that looked like they could double as storage containers, and a cooler that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Maybe we should start with catching anything at all," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Marcus laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that suggested he thought I was being too modest. He hefted one of the tackle boxes and started walking toward the docks. "Come on, man. You've heard the stories about these waters. Fish out there bigger than anything you've ever seen." I grabbed the cooler and followed him down the wooden walkway. The dock creaked under our feet, and I could hear water lapping against the hulls of the boats on either side of us. Most of the slips were dark and quiet, their owners probably still asleep in their beds like normal people. The Orca 3 sat at the end of the pier, and even in the dim light from the marina's overhead lamps, I could see she'd been around for a while. The paint on her hull had faded from white to more of a cream color, and there were patches where repairs had been made over the years. But she looked solid, the kind of boat that had seen plenty of action and lived to tell about it. A man emerged from the cabin as we approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He was probably in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending decades on the water. His hair was gray and thinning, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who knew every inch of his vessel. "You must be the Thomas party," he said, extending a hand. "Frank Miller. Welcome aboard the Orca 3. Marcus dropped his gear and shook Frank's hand with the kind of grip that was meant to establish dominance. "Marcus Thomas. This is my brother-in-law, Ben." I shook Frank's hand as well, noticing the calluses and the firm grip of someone who worked with his hands for a living. "Pleasure to meet you both," Frank said. "Leo's just finishing up with the supplies. We should be ready to head out in about 20 minutes. As if on cue, another man appeared from below deck, carrying a case of water bottles. He was younger than Frank, probably in his 30s, with dark hair and the lean build of someone who spent his days hauling fishing gear around. He nodded to us politely but didn't stop working. "That's Leo Rodriguez, my first mate," Frank explained. "Best mate I've ever worked with." Marcus was already looking out toward the open water, even though there wasn't much to see in the darkness. "So, Captain," he said, "I was thinking we might want to head out a little farther than usual today. I've been reading about some of the deeper waters out there. The fish that come up from those depths." Frank's expression became more cautious. Well, we usually work the continental shelf, maybe 30-40 miles out. Plenty of good fishing in those waters. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a roll of cash thick enough to choke a horse. He held it casually, but made sure Frank could see it. I'm willing to pay extra for the full experience. The kind of fishing trip people tell stories about. I watched Frank's eyes flick to the money, then back to Marcus's face. The internal calculation was obvious. Extra money versus the unknown risks of venturing into unfamiliar territory. Those deeper waters can be unpredictable, Frank said slowly. Weather changes fast out there and... I've been fishing my whole life, Marcus interrupted. Caught a 200-pound tuna off Cape Hatteras last year, pulled in marlins in the Bahamas. I'm not looking for a tourist trip, Captain. I want to catch something worth mounting on my wall. Leo had finished loading the supplies and was now checking lines and equipment with methodical precision. He glanced up at the conversation, and I caught something in his expression, a wariness that matched my own growing discomfort. The forecast is calling for some weather later today, Leo said, his voice quiet but clear. Might want to stick closer to shore. Marcus waved a dismissive hand. Weather forecasts are wrong half the time anyway. Besides, a little chop just makes it more exciting. Frank looked at the money again, then at his boat, then out toward the dark ocean. I could see him weighing the decision, the safe, routine trip versus the kind of payday that would make the difference between a good month and a great one. Those canyon areas you're talking about, Frank said finally. They're 60-70 miles out. That's a long way from help if something goes wrong. Nothing's going wrong, Marcus said, with the confidence of someone who'd never faced a situation he couldn't buy his way out of. We've got the best captain in the Outer Banks, right? That's what everyone told me. It was manipulation, pure and simple, but it was effective. Frank's shoulders straightened slightly at the compliment, even though he had to know what Marcus was doing. I could take you out to the canyon edges, Frank said slowly, but we leave at the first sign of trouble. No arguments, no discussion. My boat, my rules. Marcus grinned and peeled off several bills from his roll. Fair enough, Captain. Your expertise, my adventure. The money changed hands, and I felt something settle in my stomach like a cold stone. This wasn't going to be the routine fishing trip I'd signed up for. Marcus had just bought us passage into waters that even experienced captains approached with caution. Leo caught my eye for just a moment, and I saw my own apprehension reflected there. But then he went back to his preparations, because that was his job, and Frank had made the decision. The sky was starting to lighten along the eastern horizon as we finished loading our gear onto the boat. Frank fired up the engines and the deep rumble of the diesels vibrated through the deck. Leo cast off the lines and we pulled away from the slip. I stood at the stern as the Orca 3 navigated through the marina's channel, watching the dock lights grow smaller behind us. Other boats were starting to stir, early risers preparing for their own day on the water. But they would be heading to the usual spots, the proven fishing grounds where generations of captains had worked safely. We were heading somewhere else entirely, into waters that Frank clearly had reservations about, funded by Marcus's ego and enabled by my own inability to speak up when I should have. The marina lights continued to fade as we cleared the inlet and headed into the open Atlantic. The horizon ahead was nothing but darkness, hiding whatever waited for us in those deep canyon waters that Marcus was so eager to explore. I gripped the rail and tried to ignore the growing certainty that this decision would change everything. I gripped the rail tighter as another swell lifted the Orca 3 and sent her rolling to starboard. My stomach had been doing backflips since we cleared the inlet, and the constant motion wasn't helping. 2 hours of this, and I was seriously reconsidering every choice that brought me out here. The engines maintained their steady rumble as Frank navigated us through the moderate seas. the bow cutting through 3-foot swells that sent spray across the deck. I'd moved to the stern, hoping the fresher air might settle my queasy stomach. But Marcus had followed me back there and showed no signs of letting up his constant commentary. "I remember this one time off Hatteras," he was saying, gesturing with his coffee mug in a way that made me nervous about the hot liquid inside. "Hooked into this monster blue marlin. Had to be 300 pounds easy. Fought that fish for 2.5 hours before we got her to the boat." Frank glanced back from the helm, his expression politely neutral. He'd been hearing variations of this story for the past hour, each telling somehow making the fish a little bigger, and the fight a little longer. "Marlins are tough fighters," Frank agreed, then turned his attention back to the GPS display mounted above the steering wheel. Leo worked methodically at the port side, rigging what looked like serious heavy-duty tackle. The rods he was setting up were massive things, built for fish that could drag a boat around. The reels were the size of dinner plates, loaded with line thick enough to moor a yacht. He moved with quiet efficiency, checking each piece of equipment twice before moving on to the next. "How much farther to these canyon areas?" Marcus asked, moving up toward the helm. The impatience in his voice had been building for the last 30 minutes. Frank checked the GPS again, then the compass mounted beside it. "Another 25 miles. We're making good time." "Good time?" Marcus laughed, but there was an edge to it. "We're barely doing 15 knots. This boat's got to have more power than that." I watched Frank's jaw tighten slightly. The Orca 3 was pushing through the swells at a steady pace, her engines running smoothly and efficiently. Pushing harder would just burn more fuel and beat the hull up unnecessarily. "These seas, this is the right speed," Frank said. "Boat takes a beating if you try to pound through weather like this." Marcus looked out at the moderate swells like they were barely ripples. "This isn't weather. Wait until you see some of the conditions I've fished in." The radio crackled with chatter from other charter boats, their voices clear and close. Most of them were working the continental shelf, 30 or 40 miles closer to shore. Captain Murphy on the Misbehaven was reporting decent action on bottom fish. The Sea Hunter had managed a couple of small tuna. Normal fishing, normal distances from land. Leo caught my eye as he secured another rod in its holder. He'd been getting quieter as we traveled farther offshore, and I could see something in his expression that matched my own growing unease. We were heading into water that felt fundamentally different from the coastal fishing grounds where these boats normally worked. "Radio's getting quiet," I said to him, trying to keep my voice casual. "Always does out here," Leo replied, but he was checking the radio's settings anyway, making sure we were on the right channel. The water around us had been changing gradually over the past hour. What started as the green-tinged coastal water had shifted to a deeper blue, and now it was taking on an almost black quality that seemed to absorb the morning light. The difference was subtle but noticeable, like crossing an invisible boundary into something older and more serious. Marcus had moved back to the tackle, examining the heavy rods Leo was preparing. "Now this is more like it," he said, hefting one of the massive reels. "What's the line test on these?" 400 pound, Leo answered, without looking up from his work. Marcus whistled appreciatively. 400. That should handle anything we run into out here. Frank glanced back at him, then returned his attention to the GPS. I could see him checking their coordinates against the chart, marking their progress toward whatever spot he had in mind. The main shipping lanes were behind us now, and the ocean felt bigger somehow, emptier. The other fishing boats were distant voices on the radio, their positions marked on Frank's GPS as dots clustered much closer to shore. We were heading into water that saw fewer visitors, where the charts showed depths measured in thousands of feet rather than hundreds. "How deep does it get out where we're going?" I asked Frank, Canyon system out there drops to 3,000 feet in some spots, he said. That's where the big fish come up from. Marcus's eyes lit up at the mention of big fish, but I felt my stomach do another uncomfortable roll that had nothing to do with seasickness. The swells were steady now, long rollers that lifted the boat and set her down with rhythmic precision. Frank had found the right angle to cut through them, minimizing the rolling motion that had been making me miserable. But even with the improved ride, I couldn't shake the feeling that each mile was taking us farther from anything resembling safety. Leo finished with the heavy tackle and moved to rigging some lighter rods, presumably for whatever smaller fish might be in the area. His movements were efficient and professional, but I noticed he kept glancing toward the horizon, as if measuring the distance to shore. "You ever fished these deep canyons before?" I asked him during a lull in Marcus's storytelling. "Few times," Leo said. "Frank knows these waters better than most." It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, and the way he said it suggested there might be reasons why most captains avoided the area. Marcus had returned to the helm, studying the GPS display over Frank's shoulder. "So this canyon system, it just drops off like a cliff?" "More or less," Frank replied. "Goes from 200 feet to 3,000 in the space of a few hundred yards. Creates updrafts, brings nutrients up from the deep water. That's what attracts the fish." And probably other things too, I thought, but kept that observation to myself. The radio chatter had grown sporadic now, with long stretches of silence between transmissions. When voices did come through, they were from boats working much closer to shore, their conversations about mundane things like bait and weather conditions. We were moving into water where few people ventured, guided by GPS coordinates that Frank checked with increasing frequency. "There," Frank said finally, pointing toward the horizon where the water looked exactly the same as everywhere else. "That's the canyon edge." Marcus immediately moved to the bow, as if he could see some indication of the massive drop-off that lay beneath the surface. I joined him, though all I could see was the same dark blue water that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "Doesn't look like much," Marcus said. "It's what's underneath that matters," Frank replied, beginning to throttle back the engines. The change in engine note was immediate and somehow final. For 2 hours, the steady rumble had been pushing us farther from shore, farther from other boats, farther from anything resembling civilization. Now, as Frank brought the Orca 3 to a stop at the edge of the underwater canyon, the sudden quiet felt ominous. Leo was already moving toward the anchor, preparing to secure the boat in position. The GPS showed our location as 60 miles offshore, a distance that had felt manageable when we were moving but now seemed vast as we sat stationary on the dark water. Frank cut the engines completely, and the ocean swallowed the sound, leaving us floating in a silence that felt heavier than it should have. The depth finder showed the bottom at just over 200 feet, but Frank had positioned us right at the edge where the seafloor disappeared into the abyss. "Welcome to the canyon," he announced, but his voice carried none of Marcus's enthusiasm for the adventure ahead. The silence felt wrong, complete and absolute in a way that made my skin crawl. Frank dropped the anchor with a splash that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, the chain rattling down into the black water below us. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by whatever waited in those depths. Leo moved to the rod holders, checking each piece of heavy tackle one more time. The massive reels gleamed in the overcast light, their 400-pound test line coiled and ready. I watched him work, methodical as always, but there was something different in his movements now. More careful, more deliberate. The water around us looked like black glass, so still it reflected the gray clouds overhead in perfect detail. I'd never seen the ocean like this, not even in the calmest harbors back home. It was as if we'd sailed into a massive mirror, one that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "Water's sure calm out here," I said, more to break the silence than anything else. Frank nodded, but his expression remained serious as he studied the fish finder mounted near the helm. The screen showed the bottom dropping away beneath us, the depth reading climbing past 2,000 feet before hitting the device's limit. "Sometimes gets like this over the deep water," he said. "Pressure systems can flatten the surface like a pancake." Marcus had moved to the bow, scanning the horizon with the kind of intensity that suggested he expected fish to start jumping out of the water at any moment. His earlier enthusiasm hadn't dimmed, but I could see the first traces of impatience creeping into his posture. "So where are all the birds?" I asked Frank. That question made him look up from the fish finder. I was right. The sky was completely empty. No gulls, no pelicans, none of the diving birds that usually followed fishing boats hoping for scraps. Even the air felt empty, like we'd sailed into some kind of void. "Birds follow the bait fish," Frank said slowly. "No birds means no bait fish." Leo had moved to the fish finder now, adjusting the settings and studying the display with growing concentration. The screen showed nothing but empty water. No fish marks, no bait schools, not even the bottom structure that should have been visible at this depth. "Anything down there?" Marcus called from the bow. Leo shook his head, tapping the screen like that might make fish appear. "Nothing showing up. Usually see something in water like this." Marcus walked back to the stern, his frustration starting to show. "Nothing? What do you mean nothing? This is supposed to be prime fishing water." "It is," Frank said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "These canyon edges usually hold plenty of fish." I watched Leo bait one of the massive hooks with a whole tuna that probably weighed 10 pounds. The fish looked fresh enough, its silver skin gleaming as he worked the hook through its body with practiced efficiency. The bait alone probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. "Maybe we should try a different spot," Marcus suggested, though it sounded more like a demand. Frank checked the GPS, then looked around at the empty water surrounding us. "This is the spot. Fish come up from the deep water here to feed. Just takes patience." "Patience." Marcus's voice had an edge to it now. "I'm paying good money for this trip, Captain. I didn't come all the way out here to sit around and wait." Leo lowered the heavy line into the water, feeding it out slowly as the weight carried the massive hook down into the abyss. The line disappeared into the black water like it was being swallowed. He set the drag on the reel and placed the rod in its holder, then moved to prepare another line. I helped him with some of the lighter tackle, rigging smaller hooks with strips of cut bait. My hands shook slightly as I worked, though I told myself it was just from the morning's seasickness. The motion of baiting hooks gave me something to focus on, besides the growing unease that had settled in my chest. The radio remained silent. During our trip out, we'd heard constant chatter from other charter boats, working the shelf waters closer to shore. Now, 60 miles from land, the airwaves were dead. Not even the Coast Guard's routine weather updates broke the quiet. Frank tried adjusting the radio's squelch, but only static came through the speakers. "Radio's working fine," he said, more to himself than to us. "Just no traffic out here." An hour passed, then 2. The lines hung motionless in the water, their tips showing no sign of life below. Even the smaller rods, which should have picked up something by now, remained completely still. Leo checked the fish finder every few minutes, but the screen stayed blank. Marcus had moved from impatience to genuine frustration. He paced the deck like a caged animal, checking his expensive watch and glaring at the motionless rod tips. "This is ridiculous," he said. "We've been sitting here for 2 hours and haven't had so much as a nibble." Deepwater fishing takes time, Frank replied, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Fish move around down there. They'll find the bait. Maybe there just aren't any fish here, I suggested. The look Marcus gave me could have melted steel. There are fish here. This is supposed to be some of the best fishing on the East Coast. Leo reeled in one of the lighter lines to check the bait. The strip of cut fish came up untouched, still perfectly intact on the hook. He examined it for a moment, then lowered it back down. "Bait's fine," he said. "Something should have hit it by now." The sun had climbed higher, burning through the cloud cover and creating an uncomfortable glare on the mirror-smooth water. The heat was building despite the early season, and sweat started trickling down my back. But the water remained eerily still, reflecting the sky with unnatural perfection. By noon, Marcus's mood had soured completely. He'd checked every rod multiple times, adjusted reels that didn't need adjusting, and generally made his displeasure known to everyone within 50 feet. "I could have stayed home and not caught fish," he said. "At least it would have been cheaper." Frank wiped sweat from his forehead and checked the GPS again, as if confirming we were still in the right place. "I've been fishing these waters for 20 years, he said. "Never seen them this dead." "Maybe we should head back to shallower water," Leo suggested quietly. "Try the shelf break where the other boats are working." Marcus turned on him immediately. "I didn't pay extra to fish where every other tourist boat goes. We're supposed to be fishing for trophy fish, not bottom feeders." "Marcus," I started, but he cut me off. "Don't start with me, Ben. I hired the best captain in the Outer Banks to take us to the best fishing water. So far, I'm not seeing much evidence of either." Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "These things happen sometimes. Ocean's unpredictable. Maybe I should find a captain who isn't afraid of real fishing," Marcus said. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Frank's knuckles went white where he gripped the wheel, but he didn't respond. Leo busied himself checking lines that didn't need checking, avoiding the confrontation. I was about to say something, anything, to diffuse the tension when Frank spoke up. "Tell you what, let's give it another 30 minutes. If nothing happens, we'll head back to the shelf break." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Frank's tone suggested this was the best offer he was going to get. 30 minutes, Marcus agreed. "Then we find some fish." The silence returned, heavier now with the weight of ultimatums and wounded pride. I watched the rod tips, willing them to show some sign of life. The water remained black and still, giving no hint of what moved in the depths below. 20 minutes passed. Then 25. Frank had his hand on the ignition key, preparing to start the engines and admit defeat. Marcus stood at the stern, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who'd been personally wronged by the ocean itself. Leo was reeling in the last of the light tackle when it happened. The heavy-duty reel on the port side suddenly exploded into motion, its drag screaming as line poured off the spool at incredible speed. The rod bent nearly double under the strain, its tip pointing straight down into the black water as something massive ran with the bait 2,000 feet below. Marcus moved faster than I'd seen him move all day, lunging across the deck toward the screaming reel. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not the steady whir of a normal fish taking line, but a high-pitched shriek as 400-pound test line ripped off the spool at a speed that seemed impossible. "Holy shit!" Marcus shouted, grabbing the rod with both hands just as it started to bend beyond what any fishing rod should be able to handle. Leo dropped the light tackle he'd been checking and scrambled toward the port side, his hands already reaching for the drag adjustment on the massive reel. But whatever had taken the bait wasn't waiting for proper fishing technique. The rod tip pointed straight down into the black water, and the line kept screaming off the spool like something was trying to drag our entire boat into the abyss. "Set the drag!" Frank yelled from the helm, his voice cutting through the mechanical screaming of the reel. Leo's fingers worked frantically at the star drag, trying to apply enough pressure to slow the run without snapping the line. But even as he tightened it, the line kept disappearing into the depths at a rate that made my stomach clench with something beyond seasickness. Marcus braced his legs against the gunwale, the rod bent so severely I was certain it would snap. His face had gone red with the strain, every muscle in his arms and shoulders straining against whatever force was pulling from 2,000 feet below us. "It's huge," he grunted through gritted teeth. "This thing is massive." The boat lurched suddenly, and I felt the deck shift beneath my feet. We were moving, not from Frank's engines, but from whatever Marcus had hooked. The force was so tremendous, it was actually pulling the Orca 3 backward through the water. "Frank!" Leo called out, his voice tight with concern. "It's dragging us!" I could hear the engines rev higher as Frank pushed them to full throttle, trying to counteract the pull. But even with both diesels running at maximum power, we continued moving backward across the mirror-smooth surface, our wake spreading behind us in the wrong direction. Marcus's feet slipped on the wet deck, and suddenly he was sliding toward the rail, the rod still clutched in his death grip. The fish, or whatever it was, had found another gear, and the line screamed off the reel even faster. I lunged forward without thinking, wrapping my arms around Marcus's waist just as he reached the edge of the boat. His weight and the pull of whatever was on the other end of that line nearly took us both over the side. I planted my feet against the deck and pulled back, feeling the strain in my lower back as I fought against forces I couldn't begin to understand. "I got you," I managed to say, though my voice came out as more of a grunt. Leo appeared beside us, adding his weight to help stabilize Marcus while trying to keep one hand on the reel. The drag was set as tight as it would go now, but the line continued to peel off in steady, unstoppable runs. "What the hell did we hook?" Marcus gasped, sweat dripping from his face despite the cool air. Frank had the boat positioned as best he could, engines straining to maintain some semblance of control, but we were clearly outmatched. Whatever was down there had more power than our 48-foot vessel, and it was taking us wherever it wanted to go. "Never seen anything like this," Leo said, his voice barely audible over the screaming reel and roaring engines. "Line should have snapped by now." Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20. My arms ached from holding on to Marcus, and his face had gone from red to pale as the constant strain took its toll. The reel showed half the spool empty now, hundreds of yards of 400-pound test line stretched down into the black water. The engines never stopped roaring, but we kept moving backward, carving a slow, steady path across the surface as whatever we'd hooked continued its relentless run toward deeper water. Frank checked the GPS every few minutes, marking our position as we were dragged farther from the canyon edge and into water that showed no bottom on the fish finder. "This is impossible," Marcus said, his voice strained from the constant battle. "Nothing fights like this." But then something changed. The steady pull wavered for a moment, the line going momentarily slack before jerking tight again. Marcus stumbled backward as the pressure released and then returned, different now, less steady, more erratic. "What's happening down there?" I asked. Leo was studying the line angle, watching how it moved through the water. Something was different. The fight had taken on a chaotic quality, like whatever we'd hooked was no longer running in a straight line. "Line's moving around," Leo observed, "like it's thrashing or something." The water around us remained perfectly calm, giving no indication of the battle taking place 2,000 feet below. But then I saw it. A dark stain spreading slowly across the surface about 100 yards ahead of us. "Is that blood?" I asked. Frank throttled back the engines and moved to the bow, squinting at the spreading dark patch. The stain was definitely blood, rising from the depths in quantities that painted the black water an even darker shade. "Something's attacking it," Frank said, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. "Something's attacking whatever we hooked." More blood appeared, and with it came chunks of flesh floating to the surface. White meat mixed with darker tissue, pieces the size of dinner plates bobbing in our wake. The amount of blood was staggering, enough to turn a significant area of ocean into a crimson slick. Marcus was still fighting the rod, but the battle had changed completely. Instead of the steady, powerful runs, whatever was on the line now fought in violent bursts, the tip of the rod jerking and dancing as something catastrophic happened in the depths below. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, staring at the blood and flesh surrounding us. Then I saw movement in the water ahead. Not the gentle swells we'd been riding all day, but something massive breaking the surface in a violent thrash of white foam and spray. "There." Leo pointed toward the disturbance. A massive shark rolled at the surface, its white belly flashing in the afternoon light. Even from our distance, I could see it was enormous. Easily 20 feet long, maybe more. A great white, bigger than any shark I'd ever imagined, thrashing in what looked like its death throes. "That's what we hooked," Frank said, his voice filled with amazement. "That's our fish." But even as he said it, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The water around the dying great white was getting darker. Not from blood, but from something rising from below. A shadow that dwarfed even the massive shark we'd been fighting. "Frank," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Look at the water." The shadow was moving upward, growing larger as it approached the surface. Whatever was down there made our 20-foot great white look like a minnow by comparison. Then it breached. The head that emerged from the depths was something from a nightmare, a mouth so massive it could have swallowed a small boat. Rows of teeth the size of dinner plates gleamed white against the black interior of its throat. An eye, easily 3 feet across, fixed on the thrashing great white with predatory intelligence. The megalodon struck without hesitation, its jaws closing around the great white's midsection with the ease of a normal shark taking a fish. There was no struggle, no dramatic battle. The ancient predator simply opened its mouth, engulfed our catch, and bit down. The fishing line snapped like thread. Marcus stumbled backward as the tension disappeared, the rod tip springing upright as if nothing had ever been attached to it. The massive reel, which had been screaming for 20 minutes, fell silent. We sat there in absolute quiet, our engines idling, staring at the creature floating 50 yards away. The megalodon hung motionless at the surface, as if displaying itself for our benefit. Its massive bulk stretched longer than our boat, a living submarine covered in scars and remora that spoke of decades spent in the deepest ocean trenches. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. We simply watched as the apex predator of a prehistoric world regarded us with ancient eyes, blood from its meal staining the water around its massive head. The silence stretched between us and the creature, two species separated by millions of years of evolution meeting in the middle of an empty ocean. The megalodon's presence filled the water around us, its sheer size making our 48-foot vessel feel like a toy bobbing on a bathtub. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, the creature began to sink. Its massive form disappeared gradually beneath the surface, leaving only ripples and the lingering stain of blood to prove it had ever been there at all. I thought it was over. The massive form had disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only the spreading stain of blood and the lingering memory of those ancient eyes. The four of us stood frozen on the deck, staring at the empty water where something from prehistory had just swallowed a 20-foot great white shark like it was nothing more than bait. Then it surfaced again. The head that broke through the black water wasn't the sleek, streamlined profile of any modern shark. This was something else entirely, broad, massive, and covered in scars that spoke of a lifetime spent ruling the deepest trenches of the ocean. But it was the eye that made my breath catch in my throat. Nearly 3 feet across and black as the water around us, it fixed on our boat with an intelligence that seemed impossible for any fish. The pupil tracked our movements, studying us with the kind of calculated assessment I'd only seen in apex predators. But this wasn't the simple hunger of a shark. This was something far more complex and infinitely more terrifying. The creature's head alone had to be 12 feet long, maybe 15. If that was proportional to the rest of its body, I was looking at something close to 60 feet in total length. Longer than our boat. Heavier than anything that should exist in modern oceans. Frank's hands moved to the ignition keys without taking his eyes off the creature. The twin diesels rumbled to life, their vibration traveling through the deck and into my bones. He engaged the transmission and began backing us away slowly, the engines barely above idle. "Nobody move," Frank whispered, his voice carrying clearly across the silent water. "Nobody make a sound." The megalodon hung motionless at the surface, its massive bulk creating barely a ripple in the mirror-smooth water. The eye continued to track our movements as Frank maneuvered the boat backward, putting distance between us and the apex predator that shouldn't exist. Marcus stood frozen at the port rail, his expensive fishing gear forgotten at his feet. His face had gone completely pale, all the earlier bravado drained away by the reality of what floated 50 yards away. But even in his terror, I could see something else working behind his eyes, the same acquisitive hunger that had driven him to demand this trip in the first place. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his jacket pocket. "Marcus, don't," I started to say, but he was already pulling out his phone. The camera flash lit up the deck like a small lightning strike, reflecting off the water and illuminating the megalodon's massive head in stark detail. For one frozen moment, the creature's scarred hide was visible in perfect clarity, a living relic from an age when monsters ruled the earth. The effect was immediate. The ancient eye blinked once, and then the massive head tilted slightly, as if the creature was processing this new stimulus. The water around its bulk began to churn, slowly at first, then with increasing violence, as something that had survived for millions of years decided we represented a threat. "Oh shit," Marcus breathed, the phone still in his trembling hand. The megalodon dove. Not the gradual sinking we'd witnessed before, but a sudden violent plunge that created a whirlpool where the creature had been floating. Tons of prehistoric flesh and bone disappeared beneath the surface with surprising speed, leaving only expanding ripples to mark where it had been. Frank gunned the engines, but our boat was never designed for speed. The twin diesels roared to full power, pushing us backward through the water at maybe 15 knots, while something unimaginable raced through the depths below us. 30 seconds passed. The engines continued their steady rumble, and our wake spread behind us in a widening V as Frank tried to put distance between us and whatever was coming. The water remained perfectly calm except for our passage, giving no hint of the monster that had to be circling somewhere beneath us. Leo gripped the port rail, his knuckles white as he stared into the black water. I found myself doing the same thing, searching for any sign of movement in the depths. The fish finder showed nothing but empty water, but something that large had to appear on the screen eventually. Then the Orca 3 exploded upward. The impact hit us from directly below the stern with the force of a freight train hitting a stalled car. The entire back end of the boat lifted completely out of the water, the twin propellers spinning uselessly in empty air as something impossibly massive drove us skyward. I felt my feet leave the deck as gravity momentarily ceased to apply. The world tilted at an impossible angle, and suddenly I was looking down at black water instead of up at gray sky. Leo slammed into the cabin wall with a sound that made me wince, his shoulder hitting the fiberglass with enough force to crack the gel coat. Marcus and I crashed to the deck together, a tangle of arms and legs as the boat reached the apex of its flight and began to fall back toward the ocean. The impact when we hit the water drove the breath from my lungs and sent equipment flying across the deck in every direction. Frank fought to maintain control as the Orca 3 wallowed in the churning water, the helm responding sluggishly to his desperate corrections. The boat had taken on a list to port, and I could hear water rushing somewhere below deck, where it definitely shouldn't be. That's when I saw the jaws. They rose from the water at the stern like something from a nightmare, each tooth the size of a dinner plate and serrated like a steak knife. The massive mouth clamped down on our swim platform with surgical precision, the ancient teeth punching through fiberglass and aluminum like it was made of cardboard. The port engine died immediately, its steady rumble cutting to silence as fuel lines severed and electrical connections shorted out. I could smell gasoline mixing with salt air as our fuel began pouring into the ocean, creating a rainbow slick that spread quickly across the black water. Frank yanked the throttles back to idle on the remaining engine, but it was too late. The Megalodon had us in its grip, and 60 million years of evolution had perfected its technique for dealing with prey. The creature shook its head once, violently, with the casual power of a dog worrying a toy. The entire stern section, swim platform, transom, and the first 3 feet of hull tore away from the rest of the boat like wet paper. Metal screamed against metal as structural supports failed, and suddenly we were looking at open ocean where the back of our boat used to be. Water rushed through the gaping hole, flooding the engine compartment and sending the Orca 3 settling deeper into the swells. The remaining starboard engine sputtered as seawater reached its air intake, and Frank's face went white as he realized we were taking on water faster than any bilge pump could handle. The Megalodon released what remained of our stern and sank back into the depths, taking with it our means of propulsion, our fuel, and any hope of making it back to shore under our own power. The massive wake of its passage rocked our crippled vessel, each wave sending more water through the jagged hole where our transom used to be. I watched the pieces of our boat floating away on the current, chunks of fiberglass, twisted metal, and the swim ladder that Marcus had been so proud of just hours earlier. The Megalodon was gone, disappeared back into whatever abyss had spawned it, but the damage was complete. We were 60 miles from shore in a sinking boat, with no engine and no way to call for help. The radio had been mounted on the stern console that was now feeding fish somewhere in the depths below us. Frank turned the key on the starboard engine, trying to restart our only remaining hope of mobility. The starter motor turned over once, twice, then clicked into silence. Salt water had reached the electrical systems, and our last engine was dead. The Orca 3 wallowed in the swells like a wounded animal, listing to port and settling deeper with each wave that washed through the gaping hole at our stern. In the distance, I could see dark clouds building on the horizon. The storm Frank had worried about earlier was finally making its presence known. Frank's hands moved across the helm with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years on the water. I watched him yank open a compartment I hadn't noticed before, pulling out a handheld VHF radio that had somehow survived the carnage. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" he barked into the device, his voice cutting through the sound of water rushing into our boat. "This is fishing vessel Orca 3, GPS coordinates." He rattled off numbers from his backup GPS unit, the one mounted above the wheel that had escaped the Megalodon's jaws. We have suffered catastrophic hull damage and are taking on water rapidly. 4 souls on board. Immediate assistance required. The radio crackled with static before a crisp voice responded. Orca 3, this is Coast Guard Sector Elizabeth City. We copy your mayday. What is the nature of your emergency? Frank's eyes met mine for a split second, and I could see him calculating exactly how much truth the Coast Guard would believe. Large marine animal attack, he said finally. Stern section destroyed, multiple hull breaches, engines compromised. Leo had already disappeared below deck, and I could hear him sloshing through water as he assessed the damage. The sound made my stomach clench. There was definitely more water down there than any boat should be able to handle. I helped Marcus to his feet, both of us still shaken by the raw power we'd just witnessed. His expensive polo shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was a cut on his forehead where he'd hit something during the impact. But it was his eyes that showed the real damage, the complete absence of the arrogance that had carried him through the morning. Coast Guard Sector, Elizabeth City, Orca 3. The radio continued. Your position is approximately 60 nautical miles offshore. Be advised that sea state is deteriorating with approaching weather front. Nearest Coast Guard cutter is approximately 4 hours from your location. Can you maintain flotation? 4 hours. The words hung in the salt air like a death sentence. I looked at the water already pooling around our feet on the cockpit deck and tried to imagine staying afloat for 4 more hours while something the size of a city bus circled beneath us. Leo's head appeared at the cabin hatch, his face grim and his clothes soaked through. It's bad, he called up to Frank. Water's coming through at least 3 different spots along the hull. Bilge pumps are running, but they're barely keeping pace. Frank tried the starboard engine again, the one that had been sputtering when the attack ended. It turned over once, coughed to life for maybe 10 seconds, then died with a grinding sound that made Leo wince. Fuel contamination, Leo explained, hauling himself up onto the deck. Salt water got into the tank when the lines ruptured, plus we lost maybe half our fuel when those lines severed. The handheld radio crackled again. Orca 3, Coast Guard Sector Elizabeth City. We are dispatching rescue helicopter from Air Station Elizabeth City, but weather conditions may prevent safe operation. Recommend you deploy life rafts and prepare to abandon vessel if condition deteriorates further. Frank's jaw tightened as he keyed the radio. Coast Guard, we have no life rafts. Repeat, no life rafts deployed. We are attempting to maintain vessel integrity and stay with the boat. I caught the edge in his voice when he said, no life rafts. The admission that this wasn't a properly equipped charter vessel for these waters, that Marcus's money had convinced him to cut corners on safety equipment. Leo moved to the port engine controls, the one that had died immediately during the attack. He tried the starter, but got nothing except a rapid clicking sound. Electricals fried, he reported. Salt water got into everything when that section tore away. The horizon had darkened considerably while we'd been dealing with the immediate crisis. What had been distant gray clouds an hour ago were now a solid wall of black approaching from the southeast. I could see the distinctive curtain of rain beneath the storm front, maybe 10 miles away and moving fast. That's when I saw the fin. It cut through the water about 50 yards off our starboard side, a dark triangle that stood nearly 4 feet above the surface. The megalodon wasn't leaving. It was circling us like a wolf around wounded prey, maintaining just enough distance to observe while planning its next move. There, I said, pointing toward the massive dorsal fin. It's still here. Marcus followed my gaze and went completely pale. All the fight had gone out of him now, replaced by the kind of fear that comes from finally understanding you're not at the top of the food chain. He sank down onto the port bench, staring at the creature that had destroyed our boat with casual indifference. Leo pulled a toolbox from the cabin and started working on the starboard engine, trying to clear the fuel lines of contaminated gasoline. His movements were quick and efficient, but I could see the tension in his shoulders every time the dorsal fin disappeared beneath the surface. "How long can we stay afloat?" I asked Frank. He checked the water level in the cockpit, which was now ankle-deep and rising steadily. "Depends on how much more damage we take. If the pumps keep working and we don't get hit again." He trailed off, unwilling to make promises neither of us believed. The fin vanished, sliding beneath the black surface like it had never been there. Immediately, all four of us tensed, our eyes scanning the water around the boat for any sign of movement. The creature could be anywhere now, directly beneath us, circling at depth, or positioning for another attack. Minutes crawled by with only the sound of Leo working on the engine and the steady hum of the bilge pumps fighting to keep us afloat. The water in the cockpit had stopped rising, which meant the pumps were finally keeping pace with the flooding, but just barely. Frank tried the radio again, updating the Coast Guard on our condition and requesting an updated ETA on rescue. The storm front was definitely moving faster than anyone had predicted, and I could see lightning flickering in the dark clouds. Leo got the fuel lines cleared and tried the starboard engine again. This time it caught and held, running rough but functional. The relief on Frank's face was immediate and obvious. With one engine working, we had options beyond sitting here and waiting to sink. "That's something," Frank said, his first positive words since the attack. But 20 minutes had passed since the megalodon had torn our stern apart, and I was starting to think maybe it had lost interest in us. Maybe we'd get lucky. Maybe the Coast Guard would reach us before the storm hit, and this would just be an expensive lesson about the dangers of pushing too far offshore. That's when the entire boat exploded upward. The impact came from directly below the center of the hull, lifting the Orca 3 completely out of the water with enough force to make me briefly weightless. I felt the deck leave my feet as 60 tons of prehistoric predator drove us skyward like we were nothing more than a cork bobbing on a pond. The sound was indescribable, metal screaming against ancient bone and cartilage as the main structural beam that ran the length of our hull cracked under pressure. No modern boat was designed to withstand. When we crashed back into the water, the impact drove me to my knees and sent Leo's tools flying across the deck. Water immediately began rushing through new cracks in the hull, overwhelming the bilge pumps that had been barely keeping pace before. The boat settled deeper into the swells, and I could feel the subtle change in how we rode the waves, heavier, more sluggish, like a boxer who'd taken one too many hits to stay on his feet. Frank grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Mayday, mayday. Orca 3 has suffered additional catastrophic damage. We are taking on water rapidly and may not be able to maintain flotation much longer." The megalodon's massive head broke the surface 30 yards away, and this time it didn't sink back into the depths. It hung there, motionless, studying us with that ancient eye, while blood from our destroyed stern mixed with the churning water around its scarred head. We were no longer dealing with hit-and-run attacks. The creature had decided we were prey, and it was positioning itself for the kill. The massive head sank slowly beneath the surface, those ancient eyes never leaving us until the black water closed over the scarred hide. Only then did the full scope of our damage become clear. Frank was already moving, his hands flying over what remained of the control panel as he assessed our situation. The depth finder flickered between readings, its screen cracked from the impact but still functional. The GPS showed our position as a small blue dot, surrounded by nothing but open ocean, 60 miles from the nearest shore. Leo hauled himself up from the engine room, water streaming from his clothes and a look of barely controlled panic on his face. "The whole center section of the hull has a crack running port to starboard," he called out, breathing hard. "Maybe 18 inches long and getting wider. Water's coming through like a damn waterfall." I could hear it now. The rushing sound of the ocean pouring into our boat through wounds that should have sunk us already. The bilge pumps were screaming constantly, their high-pitched whine mixing with the rumble of our one remaining engine. Frank grabbed the GPS unit, his fingers working quickly across the screen as he pulled up a wider view of our area. His eyes searched the digital chart, looking for something, anything, that might save us. "Devil's Triangle Reef," he said suddenly, pointing at a small marking on the screen northwest of our position. 15 miles. Coral formation, real shallow water. Maybe 3-4 feet at high tide. Leo caught on immediately. Too shallow for that thing. Marcus looked between them, still dazed from the impact. "We're going to crash into a reef?" "Better than staying here to get eaten," Frank replied, already turning the wheel to port. The boat responded sluggishly, fighting the water weight we'd taken on and the damage to our hull structure. The engine note changed as Frank pushed it harder, and I felt the deck vibrate differently beneath my feet. Everything about the Orca 3 felt wrong now. The way we rode the swells, the subtle list to starboard, the constant sound of water where it shouldn't be. Frank keyed the handheld radio. "Coast Guard Sector, Elizabeth City. This is Orca the 3rd. We are changing course to Devil's Triangle Reef, bearing 290 degrees from our current position, attempting to beach the vessel in shallow water to avoid further animal attack." The response came back immediately. "Orca 3, be advised that Devil's Triangle Reef is a known navigation hazard. Approach with extreme caution. Storm front is moving faster than predicted. You have maybe 40 minutes before conditions become unsurvivable for small craft." 40 minutes. I looked at the GPS showing 15 miles to the reef and did quick math in my head. At our current speed, fighting increasing seas and a damaged hull, we might just make it. Leo disappeared below again, and I could hear him splashing through rising water as he worked on keeping our one engine running. The sound of the bilge pumps had changed pitch, working harder but fighting a losing battle against the increasing flow through our cracked hull. Marcus found a bucket somewhere and started bailing water from the cockpit, his movements mechanical and desperate. I grabbed another container, a bait bucket that had somehow survived the attacks, and joined him. The work was endless and probably futile, but it gave us something to do besides wait for our boat to sink. The storm was building faster than anyone had predicted. What had been distant dark clouds an hour ago now filled half the sky, and I could see the wall of rain approaching like a gray curtain across the water. The wind had picked up noticeably, creating whitecaps that hadn't been there during our fight with the megalodon. That's when I saw the fin again. It emerged from the water maybe 50 yards behind us, cutting through our wake with mechanical precision. The creature was following us, pacing our damaged boat like a predator that knew its prey was wounded and could afford to be patient. "It's still there," I called out to Frank, pointing at the massive dorsal fin. Frank glanced back, his jaw tightening as he saw the megalodon maintaining its distance. "As long as it stays back there, we're okay. Problem comes if it decides to hit us again." Leo's head appeared at the cabin hatch. "Engine temperature's climbing," he reported. "Salt water got into the cooling system during that last hit. If it overheats, we're dead in the water." The GPS showed 12 miles to Devil's Triangle Reef. Still too far, especially if our engine failed. I could see Frank doing the same calculations, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The seas were building steadily now, rolling swells that made our damaged boat wallow and pitch in ways that would have been uncomfortable, even when we were intact. Each wave that broke over the bow sent more water below deck, adding to the load our failing bilge pumps were fighting. Marcus paused in his bailing to look at the approaching storm. "How bad is this going to get?" Frank checked the wind gauge, which was somehow still working, despite everything we'd been through. 30 knots already. Could hit 50 or 60 before this thing passes. 8-foot swells rolled beneath us, each one a reminder of how small and fragile our boat was in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. The Orca 3 creaked and groaned as she rode up each wave face and crashed down into the trough, her damaged hull protesting every impact. The Megalodon's fin disappeared again, sliding beneath the surface like it had never been there. Immediately, all of us tensed, scanning the water around the boat for any sign of the massive predator. The creature had already demonstrated it could surface anywhere, anytime, with devastating results. Leo emerged from below carrying an armload of tools, his face grim. Cooling system's failing faster than I can fix it. Maybe 10 more minutes before the engine seizes. 10 minutes. The GPS showed we still had 9 miles to go. Frank pushed the throttles forward, coaxing every bit of speed our damaged boat could manage. The engine note climbed higher, straining against the water weight and hull damage that was robbing us of precious knots. A massive wave rolled under us, lifting the bow high before dropping us into the following trough with a crash that I felt in my bones. Water exploded over the bow, flooding the cockpit and sending both Marcus and me scrambling to keep our footing. "Pump faster," Frank called back to us, though I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. I dumped another bucket of water over the side and immediately started filling it again. The cycle felt endless. Bail, dump, bail, dump, while our boat settled deeper with each passing minute and the storm built around us. The radio crackled with an update from the Coast Guard. Orca 3, sea state has deteriorated beyond safe helicopter operations. Rescue vessel ETA is now approximately 6 hours due to storm conditions. 6 hours. We didn't have 6 minutes, let alone 6 hours. That's when the engine temperature gauge moved into the red zone, the needle climbing steadily toward the point where our last hope of propulsion would die completely. Leo's voice carried up from the engine room, tight with controlled panic. "Temperature's critical. We've got maybe 2 minutes before she seizes up completely." The GPS showed 8 miles to Devil's Triangle Reef. Still too far. Way too far. Frank keyed the radio one more time. "Coast Guard, Orca 3. Engine failure imminent. We may not reach our intended destination." The massive dorsal fin reappeared in our wake, closer now, maybe 30 yards behind us. The Megalodon had been patient, but something told me that patience was about to run out. I watched the needle climb past the red line on the temperature gauge, the metal pointer trembling against the far edge of the dial like it was trying to escape the reality of what that reading meant. Steam had started rising from the engine compartment, visible through the open hatch where Leo disappeared again with another armload of tools. The boat shuddered beneath my feet as Frank pushed the throttles forward anyway, coaxing whatever remained of our dying propulsion. The sound coming from below changed pitch, becoming rougher, more labored, like an old man trying to run a marathon on broken legs. Leo's head appeared at the hatch, his face streaked with oil and salt water, exhaustion carved into every line around his eyes. "Water levels reached the alternator," he called up, his voice barely audible over the engine noise and rising wind. "She's going to seize any minute now. The cooling system's completely compromised." Frank's knuckles went white against the wheel, but he kept the throttles where they were. 8 miles still showed on the GPS to Devil's Triangle Reef. 8 miles might as well have been 80 at the rate we were traveling through increasingly rough seas. That's when I felt it. A subtle bump against the hull from somewhere below, like we'd grazed a submerged log. Except there were no logs 60 miles offshore in water that had been over 2,000 feet deep until recently. Marcus stopped bailing mid-motion, the bucket frozen halfway to the rail. "Did you feel that?" Another bump, this one from the port side, stronger and more deliberate. The entire boat shifted sideways for a moment before settling back into the swells. Whatever was down there wasn't accidentally running into us anymore. I moved to the depth finder, its cracked screen still functioning despite everything we'd been through. The numbers were changing now, slowly but steadily. 1,800 feet, 1,700, 1,600. The ocean floor was rising as we approached the reef system, but we were still in deep enough water for the megalodon to operate. Frank must have seen the same readings because he leaned harder on the throttles, trying to squeeze another knot of speed from our failing engine. The temperature gauge needle actually bent against its stop now, the mechanism never designed to register heat this extreme. The wind had built considerably in the past 20 minutes, and I could feel it pushing against my back as I worked. Whitecaps rolled past us with increasing frequency, some breaking over the bow and sending spray across the cockpit that mixed with the water we were trying to bail. Marcus suddenly straightened, pointing toward the starboard side. There, right there. The massive dorsal fin cut through a wave crest maybe 20 feet away, close enough that I could see individual scars marking the dark hide. The creature wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't maintaining the careful distance it had kept earlier. It was pacing us openly now, like a wolf following wounded prey that could no longer run. Leo climbed up from below, his shirt completely soaked and his face grim. "That's it," he announced. "She's going to seize up completely in the next few minutes. I can smell the metal burning down there." Frank checked the GPS again, his jaw working as he calculated numbers that didn't add up to survival. 20 minutes, he said finally. Maybe 20 minutes before she dies completely. 20 minutes to cover 8 miles in a boat that was taking on water faster than we could pump it out, through seas that were building toward full storm conditions, while something the size of a city bus shadowed our every move through the dark water. A massive wave rolled toward us from the southeast, larger than anything we'd encountered yet, its face steep and angry with white foam streaming from its crest. Frank tried to take it at an angle, but our damaged hull responded too slowly. The wave caught us broadside and exploded over the stern, sending a wall of green water crashing into the cockpit. The water hit me like a physical blow, driving me to my knees and filling my mouth with salt. Marcus went down hard against the port gunwale, his bucket disappearing overboard as he fought to keep from following it. The entire back half of the boat disappeared under churning white water for what felt like forever before the Orca 3 struggled back to the surface. But something had changed. The steady hum of electrical systems, depth finder, GPS, radio, flickered and died. Sparks flew from the control panel as salt water found circuits that were never meant to get wet. The lights that had been illuminating our cockpit went dark, leaving us in the gray twilight of the approaching storm. "Son of a bitch," Frank muttered, slapping the side of the GPS unit. The screen remained black, our electronic lifeline to the reef's location wiped out by one wave too many. Leo was already moving, pulling open a storage compartment I hadn't noticed before. He dragged out a canvas bag that contained emergency flares, their red plastic tubes looking almost toy-like against the scope of our problems. I grabbed my bucket again and started bailing with renewed desperation, the water in the cockpit now ankle-deep and rising faster than ever. Each scoop felt meaningless against the ocean pouring in through cracks in our hull, but stopping meant admitting we were beaten. The engine note changed again, becoming more labored, punctuated by grinding sounds that made Leo wince each time they occurred. Steam rose continuously from the engine compartment now, and I could smell burning metal mixing with the salt air. Marcus found another container, a coffee can from somewhere, and resumed his own desperate bailing. Neither of us spoke, both understanding that talking used energy we couldn't spare. The only sounds were the rushing of water, the dying engine, and the increasing roar of wind as the storm continued building around us. That's when the dorsal fin disappeared. One moment it was there, cutting through the swells 20 feet away like a dark promise, and the next it was gone. The water around us showed no trace of the massive creature that had been shadowing our failing boat. Frank's eyes swept the water in all directions, his hands tight on the wheel, even though steering was becoming increasingly difficult as our hull settled deeper. Where'd it go? Leo held a flare in each hand, his thumb hovering over the striker caps. The absence of the fin was somehow worse than its presence, because now we had no idea where 60 feet of prehistoric predator was hiding in the black water around us. The depth finder was dead along with everything else electrical, so I had no way to track the rising ocean floor that meant safety. But Frank seemed to know these waters even without instruments, pointing toward a section of horizon that looked identical to everywhere else. "Devil's Triangle's that way," he said, though his voice carried less confidence than it had an hour ago. "Maybe 6 miles now. 6 miles with an engine that was about to die completely, in a boat that was sinking incrementally with each wave, while something that shouldn't exist prepared for an attack we couldn't see coming." The storm had swallowed most of the available light now, turning the world into various shades of gray and black. Rain began falling in earnest, adding to the water we were fighting and reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards in any direction. I bailed another bucket of water over the side and immediately started filling it again, the routine automatic now. But my eyes kept scanning the dark water around us, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of where the megalodon was positioning itself for what felt like an inevitable final assault. The grinding sound that came from below deck was unlike anything I'd heard before. Metal against metal, in a way that spoke of complete mechanical failure. The engine note that had been rough and labored suddenly cut to nothing, leaving us with only the sound of wind and waves and the bilge pumps that were fighting a losing battle. Frank's hand flew to the ignition, turning the key frantically. The starter motor cranked, but nothing caught. He tried again, pumping the throttles, his movements becoming more desperate with each failed attempt. The smell of burned metal drifted up from the engine compartment, mixing with the salt spray that was now coming over the bow regularly. Leo had already moved to the storage compartment near the stern, dragging out what looked like a canvas bag attached to a heavy rope. "Sea anchor," he called over the increasing wind as he began deploying it over the side. "Might slow our drift toward deeper water." That's when I saw it, a line of white water maybe 3 miles ahead, stretching across the horizon like foam on a bathtub. The reef. Frank had been right about the distance, even without his GPS. But 3 miles might as well have been 30 without an engine to push us through the building seas. The sea anchor caught, and I felt the boat's motion change slightly as the canvas drogue bit into the water behind us. We were still drifting with the wind and current, but slower now, more controlled. Frank kept working the ignition, sweat mixing with salt spray on his face despite the cold wind. Marcus had stopped bailing and was staring at the white water ahead, his face a mixture of hope and desperation. "Can we make it?" "Not without an engine," Frank replied, his voice tight as he tried the starter again. This time there wasn't even the sound of the motor turning over. Whatever had seized up below deck wasn't coming back to life. Leo finished securing the sea anchor and started checking the remaining equipment scattered around the cockpit. Most of our gear had been lost overboard during the previous attacks, but he managed to find a few items that had been lashed down securely enough to survive. The water in the cockpit was now well past ankle deep, and my back ached from the constant bailing, but I kept dumping bucket after bucket over the side, knowing that stopping meant watching our boat sink that much faster. The bilge pumps were still running, their whine barely audible over the wind, but they couldn't keep up with the water pouring through the cracks in our hull. That's when the impact hit. The strike came from the starboard side with the force of a freight train, lifting that entire side of the boat clean out of the water. I felt myself leave the deck completely, weightless for a moment before crashing down hard against the port gunwale. My shoulder hit the rail with enough force to send lightning through my arm, and I rolled across the slippery fiberglass trying to find something to grab onto. The Orca 3 tilted at an impossible angle, taking on water through the scuppers and over the starboard rail as the massive impact drove us sideways. I could hear Frank shouting something, but the words were lost in the sound of rushing water and splintering fiberglass. As the boat settled back into the swells, I realized something fundamental had changed. We were riding lower, much lower, and the list to port was pronounced enough that I had to brace myself against the slanted deck. Water was pouring into the cockpit from multiple directions now, overwhelming our ability to bail it out. Leo appeared at my side, helping me to my feet as we both assessed the damage. Along the starboard side, I could see fresh cracks in the hull, not hairline fractures like before, but serious structural damage that went deep into the boat's ribs. 2 distinct lines ran from the waterline up toward the deck edge, and through them, the ocean poured steadily into our sinking vessel. "Emergency flare gun," Marcus said suddenly, his voice cutting through my inventory of damage. He was already moving toward the cabin, pulling open what remained of a storage compartment. His hands emerged with a bright orange plastic gun that looked more like a toy than a serious piece of safety equipment. Frank had given up on the engine and was scanning the water around us, his eyes moving constantly as he searched for signs of our attacker. "Where is it?" he called out, though none of us had an answer. Leo was already at work, hauling containers from various parts of the boat. Bait buckets, fuel cans, anything that might serve as a distraction. He began dumping them overboard one by one, creating a slick of fish oil and gasoline that spread across the dark water around our listing boat. "Chum trail," he explained between throws. "Maybe it'll follow that instead of us." I watched the containers disappear into the swells, each one taking with it something we might need later, but couldn't afford to keep now. The fuel cans went over last, their contents creating rainbow patterns on the surface that spread outward in the wind. For a few minutes, the water around us remained empty, except for the debris Leo had scattered. The white water of the reef looked closer now, maybe 2.5 miles, but still impossibly far for a boat that was settling deeper with each passing wave. Frank had positioned himself at the helm, though without an engine there was little he could do beyond watch the waves and try to anticipate which direction they were pushing us. A particularly large swell rolled under us, lifting the bow high before dropping us into the trough with a crash that sent more water flooding over the sides. That's when I saw the shadow moving beneath us. It was huge, longer than our boat, and moving with purpose through the dark water directly below. The chum trail had worked for maybe 5 minutes, but now the creature was back, and it was done playing games. The water around us began to churn as something massive rose from the depths. Frank saw it too and grabbed for the wheel, though there was nothing he could steer with. Marcus raised the flare gun, his hands shaking as he tried to track movement in the water. The megalodon exploded from the ocean 20 feet off our starboard bow like a living missile, water cascading from its scarred hide as it launched itself partially into the air. For a moment that felt like hours, I stared directly into its open mouth, rows of teeth each the size of dinner plates, a throat dark enough to swallow our entire boat. The creature crashed back into the water with tremendous force, sending a wave across our deck that knocked me flat against the cockpit sole. As I struggled to get back up, I heard the sharp crack of fiberglass failing somewhere behind me. The cabin windows exploded inward as the impact wave hit them, sending glass fragments flying across the cockpit in a glittering cloud. Frank ducked behind the helm as shards rained down around us, and I felt several pieces bite into my arms as I tried to shield my face. When I looked up, the handheld radio that Frank had been using was gone, swept overboard by the wave or destroyed by flying glass. Our last connection to the Coast Guard had just vanished along with any hope of rescue coordination. The megalodon's massive head rose from the water directly beside the cockpit, close enough that I could see individual scars crisscrossing its hide and count the remora attached to its bulk. The black eye, nearly 3 feet across, fixed on me with an intelligence that was utterly alien yet completely focused. Water dripped from its partially open jaws as it studied us, and I realized I was looking directly into the mouth of something that had been perfecting the art of killing for 60 million years. The teeth were even more massive up close, each one designed to shear through bone and muscle with surgical precision. Marcus stepped forward, the flare gun raised and aimed directly at that cavernous mouth. His hands had stopped shaking, and for the first time since this nightmare began, his voice was completely steady. "Get away from us," he said, and pulled the trigger. The flare erupted from the gun in a stream of red fire, arcing across the few feet between the boat and the creature's open mouth. It struck somewhere back in that dark throat and exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the megalodon's entire head from the inside. The reaction was immediate and violent. The massive head thrashed from side to side as the burning phosphorus did its work, and the creature let out a sound I felt in my chest more than heard, a deep, rumbling roar of pain and rage that seemed to come from the ocean itself. The megalodon dove, its tail flukes slapping the surface as it disappeared into the depths. For the first time in hours, the water around us was empty of any sign of the creature that had been hunting us. Frank was already moving, reading the waves that were building around us as the storm continued to worsen. A particularly large swell was approaching from the southeast, its face steep and powerful enough to push us significantly closer to the reef if he could catch it right. "Hold on," he called out, gripping the wheel even though we had no propulsion. As the wave reached us, he turned the boat to take it at an angle that would carry us forward rather than simply rolling under us. The Orca 3 rode up the wave face, and for a moment we were surfing down its backside, pushed toward the white water that meant safety. But we were still too far away, and without an engine to maintain our position. The next wave would likely push us back toward deeper water. That's when I felt the first structural beam give way beneath my feet. The sound of metal failing under stresses it was never designed to handle. Our boat was coming apart piece by piece, held together now by habit more than engineering. The reef's white water looked closer, maybe 2 miles now, but the Orca 3 was settling deeper with each wave, her broken ribs letting in more ocean than we could possibly bail out. Frank caught my eye across the cockpit, and I saw in his face the same realization that was growing in my own mind. We weren't going to make it to the reef as a boat. If we were going to reach those shallow waters at all, it was going to be in pieces. My ears were still ringing from the flare's explosion when Frank grabbed the wheel with both hands, his knuckles white against the useless helm. The megalodon had vanished into the depths, leaving only churning water and the acrid smell of burned phosphorus hanging in the salt air. "That gap!" Frank shouted over the wind, pointing toward the white water ahead. "See it? Between those 2 coral heads." I followed his gaze and spotted what he meant. A narrow channel, cutting through the reef line where the foam looked less violent, less like a meat grinder waiting to destroy anything that approached. The opening couldn't have been more than 30 feet wide, barely enough room for our boat even if we'd had perfect steering control. Leo was already moving, grabbing everything that wasn't nailed down and shoving it into the cabin. "Anything loose is going to become a projectile," he called out, his movements quick and efficient despite the boat's increasing list to port. The water in the cockpit was now mid-calf deep, and each wave that broke over our bow added to the flood. My bucket felt meaningless in my hands. but I kept bailing anyway, muscle memory taking over where rational thought had abandoned ship along with our engine. A massive swell approached from behind us, larger than anything we'd encountered yet. Its face rose like a moving wall, dark water streaked with foam and carrying enough power to either save us or finish what the megalodon had started. Frank positioned the boat to take it at an angle, trying to catch the wave's energy without letting it flip us sideways. "Here we go," he muttered, and I felt the stern lift as the wave caught us. The Orca 3 surfed down the wave face, pushed forward by forces far beyond our control. For a moment, we were actually moving fast again, the reef's white water rushing toward us with terrifying speed. The gap Frank had spotted grew larger in my vision, and I started thinking we might actually make it. That's when the water exploded behind us. The megalodon launched itself from the depths like 60 feet of pure rage, the flare's damage having done nothing but make it more determined to finish what it had started. Water cascaded from its scarred hide as it rose completely out of the ocean, its massive jaws already opening to engulf our stern. The creature crashed down on the back of our boat with the force of a falling building. Its teeth, each one the size of a dinner plate, closed around the transom with surgical precision. I heard the sound of fiberglass and aluminum being crushed like paper as those ancient jaws found their grip. The impact drove us forward even faster, the megalodon's attack actually pushing us toward the reef gap with tremendous force. Frank fought to keep us lined up with the narrow opening as our boat accelerated beyond anything its damaged hull could handle. The reef rushed toward us at impossible speed, white water and sharp coral growing larger by the second. I could see individual coral formations now, their razor edges jutting up through the shallow water like the teeth of some massive underwater saw. "Hold on!" Frank screamed, but his words were lost in the thunderous sound of our boat being shaken apart by 60 million years of predatory evolution. The Orca 3 hit the coral reef with the force of a runaway train. The impact threw me forward like I'd been shot from a cannon. The deck disappeared from beneath my feet, and suddenly I was flying through salt spray and foam, my body tumbling through space with no control over where I might land. I hit the water hard, the breath driven from my lungs as I plunged into churning surf that felt more like liquid concrete than ocean. Coral raked across my back and arms as the waves drove me down, each piece of reef like a cheese grater against my skin. The taste of blood mixed with salt water filled my mouth as I fought toward what I hoped was the surface. When my head finally broke through, I found myself in a washing machine of white water and debris. Pieces of the Orca 3 floated past me, sections of hull, cushions, equipment scattered like confetti across the violent surf. The boat itself was gone, broken into fragments that the reef continued to grind into smaller pieces. I spotted Frank maybe 20 feet away, clinging to what looked like part of our cabin door. His face was cut and bleeding, but he was conscious and fighting to stay afloat in the pounding waves. Beyond him, I could see Leo hauling Marcus through the surf toward a section of coral that rose above the waterline. Another wave picked me up and slammed me down onto the reef, coral cutting into my chest and shoulder as I tried to find handholds on the sharp surface. Everything I grabbed seemed designed to slice flesh, but I held on anyway, knowing that letting go meant being swept back toward deeper water where the megalodon waited. The creature was still there, thrashing in the deeper water just beyond the reef line. Its massive bulk couldn't follow us into the shallow area where coral heads rose within 3 feet of the surface. But it hadn't given up. The ancient predator circled the reef's edge like a frustrated wolf, its dorsal fin cutting through the swells as it searched for a way to reach its escaped prey. I hauled myself onto a coral platform that cut my hands and knees with every movement. The exposed reef was like walking on broken glass, each step opening new wounds, but it was solid ground in a world that had gone completely liquid. Leo had already pulled Marcus to safety on another coral head about 30 feet away, both men bloodied but alive. Frank made it to shore moments later, dragging himself onto the sharp coral with movements that spoke of significant injury. The piece of hull he'd been using as a float drifted away, carried by the current toward the reef's grinding edge where it was quickly reduced to splinters. That's when I noticed the smaller shadows moving through the water around us. The blood from our various cuts had attracted attention from the reef's permanent residents. Reef sharks, maybe 5 or 6 feet long, circled the shallow water between our coral islands. They weren't the mindless eating machines that movies portrayed, but they were definitely interested in the blood trail we were leaving in the water. "Don't move suddenly," Frank called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "They're just curious right now." One of the sharks passed close enough to my coral perch that I could see its black eyes and the white tips on its fins. It moved with the fluid grace of something perfectly adapted to its environment, investigating the unusual disturbance in its territory. When it lost interest and swam away, I realized I'd been holding my breath. The storm continued to pound us with rain and wind, each wave sending spray across our coral refuges. The sharp reef cut into whatever part of my body touched it, and I could feel blood running from dozens of small wounds. But we were alive, and more importantly, we were in water too shallow for the megalodon to reach. Marcus had gone completely quiet, sitting hunched on his coral platform with his arms wrapped around his knees. The arrogant man who had demanded this trip was gone, replaced by someone who had seen too much of what the ocean could do when it decided to show its teeth. Leo was examining a deep cut on his forearm, using strips torn from his shirt to make a crude bandage. The first mate's practical nature hadn't abandoned him even here, and he worked methodically to address the most serious bleeding before it became a bigger problem. Hours passed in a blur of wind, rain, and the constant sound of waves crashing over the reef. The storm reached its peak sometime in the middle of the night, battering us with rain so hard it felt like needles against exposed skin. I lost track of time completely, focused only on maintaining my grip on the coral despite the pain it caused. When the first gray light of dawn finally appeared on the eastern horizon, I was surprised to still be alive. The storm had weakened considerably, though waves still broke over our reef with enough force to require constant attention. My entire body ached from the cuts and the awkward positions required to stay on the sharp coral. That's when I heard it. The distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air. Frank heard it too, his head snapping up as he scanned the sky. Leo was already reaching for something in his pocket, pulling out what looked like a small electronic device that had somehow survived our ordeal. An emergency beacon, its red light blinking steadily as it transmitted our location to anyone listening. The Coast Guard helicopter appeared over the reef line like salvation with rotors, its orange and white paint scheme brilliant against the gray morning sky. The aircrew had found us, guided by the beacon signal and probably the debris field that marked where the Orca 3 had met its end. As the helicopter moved into position above us, I caught sight of movement in the deeper water beyond the reef. The megalodon's massive dorsal fin still patrolled the edge of our shallow sanctuary, a dark reminder of the encounter that had brought us to this razor-sharp refuge. The creature had waited through the entire storm, maintaining its territory around the reef, like a patient predator that knew its prey might eventually have to return to deeper water. Even now, with rescue approaching, the ancient hunter continued its slow circles in the depths where it ruled without challenge. But we were beyond its reach now, clinging to our coral refuge as rescue equipment lowered from the helicopter above. The cuts from the reef would heal, and our story would sound impossible to anyone who hadn't lived it. The megalodon would return to the deep canyons where such creatures belonged, carrying its scars and its secrets back to the lightless depths where the ocean kept its oldest mysteries. I watched the rescue basket descend toward us and tried to convince myself that the nightmare was finally over.